Hello everybody, I'd like to call this meeting to order. We're privileged to meet on the Stalo unceded traditional territory of the Chilliwack, Samath, and Pulault. The board also acknowledges the marginalization that many members of our community have experienced, whether as a result of race, sexual orientation and gender identity, or other personal circumstances. The board is committed to providing a working and learning environment that recognizes the inherent dignity of all persons, that is inclusive of all, and that treats everyone with respect. Okay, can I get a motion to adopt the agenda, please? Trustee Swanky, seconded by Trustee Bondar. Is there any discussion about the agenda? All those in favor of adopting the agenda as circulated? That's unanimous. Thank you, trustees. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes, please? Trustee Westerby, do I have a seconder? Trustee Bondar, are there any errors or omissions in the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes as circulated? That's unanimous. Thank you, trustees. Okay, so we are moving on to the first order of business, which is presentations. We are starting with the public budget presentation. So I just want to let everyone know, typically the board meetings have 2 times where people can ask questions, but because the public budget presentation is a public budget presentation that we're choosing to hold during the board meeting, there will be an extra opportunity for people to ask questions if they're confused about anything, if they want clarification. This isn't questions for the board. This would be clarifying questions to the Secretary Treasurer or Assistant Secretary Treasurer. Likely trustees will also have questions, so you might want to wait and see if the trustees ask any questions, but we will have Lisa over there looking in the audience. If you have a question, you can put up your hand, and when there's a natural break, I can call on you and you can come up. It'll be the same time limits as normal, but you can ask questions during the public budget presentation, so you don't have to wait until the other part of the agenda where we're talking about the action items that are on the agenda. Is that okay with everybody? Everybody got that? All right. So that all being said, we will move on to Secretary Treasurer, who will do the public budget presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Rochelle. Well, tonight joining me for this presentation is my colleague, Mark Friesen. So you'll see the two of us tag teaming here, and I'll get things going. So first, we're going to present the preliminary thinking on our 23-24 budget. At the next board meeting, we'll be delivering a draft preliminary budget, which is the formal document that we end up approving and sending over to the ministry. Okay, so we are privileged to work, learn and play on the territories of the Pulaut, Chilliwack and Samath, as we've already mentioned, but it's worth emphasizing because it's such a privilege. All right, so we have 6 topics that we're going to cover today. The first one is the guiding principles that tell us how we should be preparing our budget and bringing it to you. The next one is timeline. We'll then provide some overall context that the district works within, which is not dissimilar from other districts throughout British Columbia, but it's always helpful to have that, to zoom back and see the big picture. We'll then go as micro as you can get, which is coming back down into the assumptions for our local budget. We'll give some highlights of the budget and how it aligns with the strategic plan, and we'll finish off by looking a little bit at some of our other funds that we have. So by saying that, the majority of today's presentation is to do with our operating fund, which is how we fund our core operations of schools. It's not to do with capital for the most part. Okay. So the guiding principles are provided in Policy 610. It's a new policy that the board approved this year, and I think it's just worth quickly reviewing, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And there's really 2 things that Policy 610 emphasizes. One of them is to establish a plan. That's what a budget always is. It's establishing a plan of how you intend to operate, and it's just putting money to those plans. And then the second thing is to get input. We have met with the budget committee a couple of times. In fact, we met with them last week, and Trustee Swanky will give a report out on that later on in the meeting. And they've helped us to actually they gave us some ideas on how to design this presentation and the kind of information that was needed. And of course, we're through the budget, we're reflecting the strategic plan, and we're constantly getting input on the strategic plan through learning sessions, presentations, and day-to-day engagement throughout the district. So we do want to thank the Budget Advisory Committee because they really did help us formulate what this presentation looks like today and sharpen some of our thinking, and we responded to a few things from last week as well. Again, it's by policy that we have a Budget Advisory Committee, and I just want to acknowledge the work of, there are 3 trustees here who are on that committee, a bunch of folks from partner groups to community members, and some students who really helped provide some colour for us when we were discussing some of the topics. I'd also, just while we're pausing on thank yous, I'd also like to thank Talena McAnally for helping to put this presentation together and keep Mark and I on track.
That's right.
And Kevin, who isn't here, I don't think he's in this room tonight, right? No, he didn't come. But he's also helped us in putting a lot of the numbers together. All right, so timeline.
Okay, I think you can all hear me from here. I don't need to adjust the mic, so I will just continue. So our timeline for putting together this preliminary budget, there's some pre-work that's done, but the big kickoff is when we get our funding announcement in March. So this is the government setting the budget for what they will fund us per student. And that really sets the goalpost for us in terms of how much revenue primarily we'll be able to use for next year's operations. Then we've been putting together preliminary budget assumptions. This is about the 4th or 5th time we've actually presented most of this. So we first talked amongst our exec leadership team and then presented to our all leaders, which includes our principal, vice principal group and our management group. Then we brought it to the board for a board learning session. So it's more of an informal session to the board so they can kind of wrap their heads around and poke at a lot of questions that they might have. And then brought it to our budget advisory committee that Simone has just spoken about last Thursday. And then tonight, here we're presenting it to yourselves and to the public at large. And as Simone said, once we're done this presentation, we'll be going back and putting together the formal budget, making sure all the numbers actually jive to what the ministry wants in a budget template. And we'll bring that back to the board in May for 3 readings to get the approvals for the June 30th deadline that we have to have it in the ministry. And if you've been following us, you've seen this document several times before where we flip between our preliminary budget and our amended budget. So now we're dealing with the bottom half of this graphic, the preliminary budget, where we've started way back in November. Actually, we've probably started a year or 2 ago thinking about preliminary budget assumptions for 23-24. As we're trying to be a strategic organization looking at our strat plan, things don't happen just year by year. We have to be looking 2-3 years out. So we want to be thinking of what is going to happen in 23-24. So as the year gets closer, we refine our assumptions, reality, okay, COVID is subsiding, things, we might have things that we might not have done 2 years ago during the pandemic that we can now do or don't do or stop doing. So we're gathering all those assumptions. And then in March and April, we're really doing the heavy lifting of actually formalizing those numbers in May and June. As I said, putting the document together for the board, the formal document, and then flipping up to the top, sorry. I love talking about this slide. Flipping up to the top just for continuity is in September, once we know how many students we have, we can refine our budget because, if we budgeted for 100, more students, we only get 50, well, I don't want to scare people, but that means obviously we have less money to work with and we have to make some adjustments. So anyways, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to give a little bit of big picture scope here. So the first thing is that our revenue mostly comes from the province. I think it's a pretty powerful graphic to see that that whole blue bottom of the graph there, that's all coming from the province. We do receive some other funding. We have some international students and they pay tuition. It's a program that's growing within the district, but It's, clearly not that big here. It's much bigger in metro area, I think. But it was actually a good thing during COVID not to be relying on external funding sources. We have a fairly large size First Nations contingent of students, so we get a lot of funding from that, and we get more, again, for those students through the province, directly through the province, but we get some federally and from the nations themselves. And then other revenue is just things like rental income, interest, and miscellaneous fees that we receive from different bodies. But that's the revenue side of things. Then turning to the expenditure side, it's sort of useful to look at some comparisons and yep. And what you can see here is I've pulled a sample of a number of districts that are about the same size as us. We're just about 14, I can hear the horns going outside, 14,800, and you can see, districts there ranging from, well, mostly from 14 to 16. Prince George is a little bit of an outlier on the low side, and we put Abbotsford usually just because they're next door to us and it's useful to see. So you can see what I've done is I've ranked it by instruction. So you can see in terms of spending on instruction, we're right there in the middle of this particular pack. What's kind of interesting and jumps out to a lot of people is the transportation. Clearly, if you're in the metro area, North Vancouver, Maple Ridge, you've got BC Transit providing a lot of transportation. Here, it's a different story. And I imagine that in Kamloops and Prince George, it's probably bigger areas that they're covering. There's also weather factors involved and so forth. So you can see that what happens on some of the other factors affects how much you can spend on instruction, and it's just kind of insightful. There's obviously a lot more and deeper stories behind this that are worth exploring over time, just as we sort of look at ourselves and where we place. But good to know that we're not an outlier, and you can sort of make sense of most school districts in the province are actually paying for instruction with 80%, 85% of their money. So then looking deeper at that, you can see on this graphic everything that's blue, light blue and dark blue combined represents instruction. So and most of it is teachers, so we spend over 50% on teachers, and then there's a sizable chunk that gets spent on education assistants and other staff in school buildings. So just to, it's a nice graphic to sort of take away and think, okay, how is the school district using its money? And hopefully that's what we all expect. So, I'll do the next slide and then I'll pass it on to you. So now what I'm going to do is go micro, which is looking much more closely at the assumptions that we have in putting our budget together. And in doing this, it's probably helpful just to show you how we put our budget together. So at the very base of everything is enrolment. We hire the teachers that we have the number of schools open that we have, and the principals and EAs, all because of certain students. If you get another student, you have to provide more instructional services to that student, another school to be cleaned, another, school where you need a principal. And then on the other side, the provincial revenue that you saw is pretty much driven by enrolment numbers. And we'll show that more powerfully in a second. So at the bottom of everything, the biggest assumption that we make is enrolment. And what we're going to do in the next couple slides after this is we're going to go through each of those factors that are dark blue here. So firstly, enrolment. The next big factor on the revenue side is the operating grant. So that's how much the province says they're going to fund us per pupil. And that could be a Indigenous pupil, it could be a special needs pupil, or a student that has multiple characteristics. So you multiply those factors by the enrolment, you get the operating grant. There's some other provincial operating grants that we get. Add those together and you've got the money that we get from the province. And then those other revenue pieces that we looked at a minute ago, interest and rentals and so forth. And on the expenditure side, clearly, a lot of our staff, the vast majority of our staff, is driven by enrolment as well. So again, the enrolment is the main driver, but we determine how many kids there are in a classroom according to a staffing, there are staffing ratios that tell us how many kids we have to have or a target for a maximum per classroom. Same with EAs. We have some ratios for principals and vice principals. So a lot of our staffing is actually driven by formula based on enrolment. So once we've got enrolment, we multiply by staffing ratios and we have most of our staff calculated. Multiply that by the wages, you've got our staffing cost, right? So I'm working up the page here. And then you've got services and supplies and you've got your expenditure side. So we'll spend the next couple of slides just looking at that bottom segment there and the key assumptions that we're making for this budget.
Oh, Trustee Moss, you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Sorry. You have to push that button.
Sorry. So I know that we get a percentage of assumed students that are learning disabled. So, and these would be the kids with, they don't come with a specific amount, even though they have a diagnosis. But we get a percentage from the ministry. Do you know what percentage that is? Do they base it on like 3% of the population or 2 or 5 or do you know what that is? No? Okay. But you can find out, right?
I can try.
Okay, thank you.
Just to indicate, the Secretary Treasurer said no while she was off mic, so just for the record, in case anyone's watching at home.
Okay, so as our Secretary Treasurer suggested, we have a few inputs that start driving our revenue and expenses through our budget. And on the revenue side is, of course, what we project to get for student enrollment. And I didn't want to scare people before I realized in my comments that I was saying, if we budget 100 and then only 50 come, we might be in trouble. Oftentimes we try to be conservative with our enrollment growth, and usually we get caught the other way where too many kids are coming, or at least in the last 5 or 10 years we've had that nice problem where there's more kids that are coming than we anticipated. We try and use a company called Baragar that tracks in-migration to the district and birth rates and all that stuff to kind of project what our kindergarten class is going to be next year and kids from out of town coming to the district. So this next year we're projecting a 1.6% increase, which is about 200 students. And you can see the growth rate over the few years. It's been about 1,000 students in the last 5 years. Next. So to educate these students, we have to look at our ratios that we have for staffing. So if we want to maintain a certain service level where we have X amount of students per teacher or EAs, we have to make sure we have the staff to go along with that in enrollment growth. And we have guidelines to do that through the School Act and then our local language and restored language that came from a Supreme Court decision a few years ago that restores the level of staffing to what it was in 2001. We have support staff ratios and admin ratios that are a lot driven by board policies or admin procedures. That's sort of a base level. We may deviate from that, go up if we have strategic initiatives where we're trying to make a difference or an influence for some targeted initiative in our strat plan where we might add more staffing, such as a helping teacher or behavior consultant or something like that. And so you wouldn't necessarily find that in policy. So to pay the staff, we of course look at what our wages and benefits are going to do for this next year. Our unionized staff, of course, their wages and benefits are set through collective bargaining, and we've just finished a 3-year bargaining term, which actually surprisingly we're at the end of the first year. So we're kind of playing catch up with the timing because some of the funding announcements and the decisions to fund the increases happened late in the year, so we didn't necessarily catch it in our current budget. So when we're looking at next year's budget, it looks like we have a cumulative 2 years of wage increases, just if someone's comparing this year's wages to next year's wages. So over 2 years, there's a cumulative increase for unionized staff of 9.7%. The specific increases you see there, this current year, we're having about a 3.7, 3.8% increase, and then next year will be a 5.5% increase before a separate negotiated cost of living allowance, which I'll speak to in a moment. So for our exempt staff, that's their PVP and management groups, they're determined a different way. Of course, they're not negotiated, but they sort of follow the same increases that our unionized staff get. Yet we have to sort of get permission from our government staffing group, BCPC. And so we expect them to be the same as what the unionized staff get. But we still haven't got confirmation of that. And the other thing is that where the unionized staff increases would be funded from the ministry, there's never a guarantee that the exempt and PVP increases would be funded the same way. So that's a little bit of a risk right now as we present this budget. But we're putting it in there partially for now. And then when we look at the benefits side, which goes along with the salaries, benefits have been gyrating. The CPP, the government's doing a mass increase over several years, so that's been a pressure. And our extended health and dental rates are going up. There's quite a bit of usage, and the cost of those services are going up. So unfortunately, that's going to add a $600,000 budget pressure to our bottom line. That's not going to be matched by any sort of funding. So we've taken that into account as we put together this budget. And as mentioned on the previous slide, there was a cost of living allowance negotiated in this last round of bargaining that was going to be deployed if the inflation rates sort of stayed high throughout this year. And we've just been informed recently that that cost of living allowance is kicking in at 1.25%, which is the maximum that staff could receive. We haven't gotten an announcement of the funding yet, so that's a bit of a dance we're trying to do with figuring out how to present the budget. But anyways, that's what our unionized staff can expect, and we'll be putting it in, of course, in our expenditure side, because that we know we have to pay that. Okay. So coming back to this is coming back to the revenue side, because, and this slide might have gone better initially with the enrollment slide, because you want enrollment times the student grant to show your revenue. But we wanted to tell the backstory of how these grant increases came about, and they're primarily because of the salary increases over the 2 years. So if you remember those slides, the cumulative increase was 9.4, 9.5%. Well, funny enough, the grant increase for the revenue per student is about the same amount. So effectively, it's intended to cover those wage increases. Though the grant covers more than wages, it does cover supplies and services, and basically all of, funds what we say 97% of our operating budget. So therefore, there is a little bit of an inflation factor that helps us with the rising costs of services and supplies in our district.
Thank you, Mark. So now we're going to delve into some details for the budget. And the one thing, well, I just want to do a few preamble comments about the budget generally. So the budget should basically not be a surprise. It's an outgrowth of our strategic plan, and if we're planning initiatives, we do that over a period of time. They'd already be, well and truly planned, and then we'd be putting the dollars to them in the budget. That's typically the idealized way of building a budget. And what that means, because I want to make sure we're not talking abstract here, is you've got a teacher in a classroom, they are in this budget. And an EA supporting that teacher, they're in this budget too. And then if we peel back a little further, we've got a strategic plan that says, here's why we have that teacher in the classroom, and here's some PD we're giving that teacher, or some additional resources, or we're pushing in EAs because of this particular strategic initiative, then that's also driving the budget. So the budget's just the numbers that get popped out at the end of the day because of all these things we're doing, and they reflect what's eventually or what's actually going to be happening in the classroom. And for that reason, this section is actually, you know, we're going to talk about some brass tacks of budgeting, but we're also going to swing over and bring in the instruction side, right? Because that's the strategic plan and instruction, that's what's driving our budget. And we'll try and, we're going to go through a slide as an example, but we've got some more materials in the presentation that you can look at online. So just bringing the couple of strands together. No, back to the other one. We talked about revenue. Enrolment has increased in our budget compared to this year by 222 FTE. So I'm just sort of going over the key assumptions, and we've got a 9.4% cumulative 2-year increase in provincial funding rates. So we just saw those couple of things. Another key assumption is that we've seen that there's approximately 9.5 cumulative collective bargaining increases. There's also been increases in some benefits costs, you know, some of the statutory ones, but also in our healthcare and pensions benefits. We've seen, you know, and we've done some analysis on this. We haven't seen a huge amount of inflation in our services and supplies, but we have actually seen some in insurance, which probably doesn't surprise too many people here if you look at your own insurance. And then what we've prepared is what we call a service level staffing budget, where, you know, we're keeping the same level of service, which is to say if we get 200 more kids, we're providing the same level of service to those 200 additional kids that we provide to all our current kids, and all our current kids are continuing to get the same level of service that they currently receive. So it's called service level. So there aren't very many targeted budget changes. We do all this with some pressures that are just worth bearing in mind. You know, there's inflation, increased employee costs. We do have to contribute as a district when we purchase capital, or in this case, vehicles. So next year we are budgeting to buy 5 new buses, and the district has to contribute approximately $300,000 towards that purchase. New schools, you know, we opened Stitos this year. And opening a new school comes with some additional costs in administrators and custodial and utilities and insurance, frankly. And then, of course, the usual pressures, which is that next slide of budget and financial risks. You know, with our assumptions, we've got, you know, a bunch of risks. We could be wrong on enrolment. So if you look at the district assumptions there, we could be wrong on enrolment. We could be wrong on capital needs. Maybe we need another portable. Maybe we don't. And some of our budget estimates and forecasts could be wrong. Similarly, for these other sort of key categories, staffing, we might find that next year we don't get as many retirements as we typically do, and our cost of staffing goes up. We might have more sick leaves and absences. You know, these are things that have happened in recent history. You know, COVID, we had a lot more sick leaves and absences. So there's a whole variety of risks that underlie the assumptions that we've put together, but what we've presented to you as our key assumptions is, you know, where we're sitting for the moment. So let's have a look at how what we're about to show you aligns with the strategic plan, or some of the thinking that we've done. So you should all probably be somewhat familiar. If you're sitting in this room, you're probably a little bit familiar with our strategic plan graphic here. At the core of that strategic plan is an educated citizen. That's what our ultimate goal is. And to get to that goal, I seem to be missing some slides here. We have strategic goals that we're focusing on that are literacy, numeracy, transitions, and human and social. I just couldn't read it up there. So they're the key areas that we focus on. Our goals in preparing students to be educated citizens, and the dimensions of practice. So the tools that we're using to get there are, you know, obviously we're always looking at data to see where we should be targeting things. We believe that it's a collective responsibility of everybody in the school district to be working, you know, towards these goals. We have targeted initiatives because not everybody needs the same thing. And of course, the core of schools, I think, in every strategic plan is high quality instruction. So the next couple of slides, and like I said, I think we're just going to review one of them, provide an illustration of how that comes into life and how it ties resources. So how does the budget come alive in that strategic plan?
Thanks, Simone. So, from Learning Services, one of the pieces finance has been asking us to really pay attention to is when we have these key initiatives, how are they connected to the resource allocation? So this is an example that we worked on, which is looking at next year, working on our competency-based IEPs, and working on and doing some work around truth and reconciliation are some key initiatives, but they all fit within the dimensions of practice. So when we're looking at these, there's a direct link to what's happening in the classroom, because through competency-based IEPs, classes are going to become more inclusive, and inclusive practices will be practiced in there. As far as collective responsibility, a lot of the work is not done by one person. It's not just the classroom teacher. It's not just the support staff. It's them working together. So there's some examples there listed around how we're working towards that. October 6th next year is a day that we've been doing some planning for, and we're excited about. It's where we're going to bring all of our staff together across the district and really focus in on building bridges towards truth and reconciliation. So again, resources that are being allocated to that work is linked back to the budget. And we're also committed to finding out how we're doing. So for example, we've been doing growth plans with teachers, and we've been doing our student engagement project, where we're listening to how are we, what's the data showing us, not just the numbers data, but the stories from the people that are in the field and the students. And all of this is also linked back to our targeted intervention. So in this case, we are looking at the work that's being done in training and support for EAs and our school-based team members. We've been talking about our equity scan as a process. We're now in year 3, and those would be some examples around targeted intervention. So this just takes us through, within a budget presentation, what are some of the initiatives that we are strategically putting in place, and what are some of the costs attached to them.
Thank you. That was David Manuel, our Assistant Superintendent of Instruction. I should have introduced him up front. So you can see that, every day the work that we're doing is woven into our strategic, or comes from our strategic plan, and that resource use is woven throughout that. So these are available to look at on the website. I think that's what we're doing here. All right. So we're still working through the final numbers. As I mentioned, we're going to bring the document to the table next time. But roughly speaking, you can see, these might change just a touch, but approximately 50% of our staff is teachers, which makes complete sense, because we just saw right at the beginning how much we spend throughout the district, and over half of that was on teachers. So intuitively that makes sense. About a quarter of our staff is actually education assistants. It's sort of interesting when I put this together to sort of see that number in relief there. And district support is things like transportation, custodial, maintenance.
Finance HR.
Who?
Finance HR.
Finance and HR. Oh yeah, we're in there too.
Do I see that there's a question from the audience?
Yes.
Come up to the podium and then press the right-hand button.
Thank you. What I'm not seeing there is management percentage. You had it as a percentage of the budget, but you don't seem to have it as a percentage of staffing.
Thank you for the question.
District manager, thank you.
I believe we can answer that. Oh, sorry. Can
Do I-
you press the button again?
Yeah, so that's the very first one, exempt staff. So that's good, yeah.
Anything else? All right. Now some numbers. See, I only have 2 or 3 slides in a budget presentation with numbers, because it's more about the story than it is about the numbers. Are just the result. So I'm going to go through this just in a little bit of detail. I'm going to go line by line, just because otherwise it it reads a little bit too busy. So in February, we brought to the board an amended budget. Unfortunately, at that time, the province hadn't released additional revenue for the cost of the salary increases this year. So that's why you see such a huge deficit for the 22-23 year. That revenue does come, and it comes next year, and you'll see 5.9 million sitting in that first row on the left-hand side there. The other thing that happened in February is that not all our labour negotiations had finished. So in fact, with our support staff, we hadn't finished negotiating, and that ended up being settled and cost an additional $1.5 million there. So that first row there, underneath the amended budget, is actually changes to do with the 22-23 fiscal year. It's nothing to do with next year. But to get from one budget to the other, I have to correct and reflect what the real starting point should be. So then I start talking about things that are happening, the assumptions that we've just talked about. So, and there's no exact science to this. So, we've got benefits increasing, it's smeared across all the categories. We've got salaries increasing, it's smeared. So, as best as I can do, or sort of indicative, the enrolment increase is going to result in some additional revenue, but we also need to hire some teachers and other staff for those students. And then, of course, we've got the collective wage agreement for 23-24. That's 5.5 we've got in here at the moment. The additional 1.25 was announced a little later. We'll be bringing that into the version that we show the board. We bring to the board in early May, so a little bit more on that later. Indigenous education, it's a significant program, so I wanted to pull out what was happening there. And it, again, there has been an enrolment increase there, so there's a little bit of overlap and so forth. And then we've got some one-time increases in some provincial grants, staffing changes, which is, oh my goodness, now I'm blanking. It's things like people like custodians, school clerical, anybody who is not directly linked to a student. We've got 2, I think, additional transportation drivers in there. We had some staff who started later in the year, so we're bringing them, we're reflecting their full year salary portion. So it's a lot of positions like that. I think Mark's pulling it up, but I think I've captured the bulk of it there. The international program, we're trying to grow it, and we've got a little bit of additional revenue there. Mark talked earlier about the fact that the benefits, when we sort of sat down and penciled it all out, it looked like it was going to cost us more than the 9.4% increase. Substitutes we've increased so that we can provide some release time to teachers to help with professional development. So that's actually that is actually a specific initiative right there. When we do factor in the 1.25% COLA increase, we are envisaging at this point in this budget, our assumption is that will not be paid for by the province, so we've considered that an additional cost. Services and supplies decreased, and also other decreased, because what we're doing is we're tamping down our capital purchases a little bit next year, and that's actually helping us to balance our budget. So what you can see in that bottom line there is next year we anticipate revenues of about 175 million and expenses of 176 million. But included in that expense are some costs for programs that are higher next year because we didn't fully spend the money this year. And one of the big ones is the Indigenous program. And you'll see off to the right there, right underneath, Indigenous program surplus carry forward, 800,000. So we're spending $800,000 more in expenses next year on Indigenous programs. It's sort of buried in there in a bunch of categories, but we're bringing the we're able to do that because we're using carry forward. So it looks like we've got a deficit of $1,000, but once you factor in all these other sort of carry forward amounts, we're actually in surplus by about 200,000. it's what we call a balanced budget, you know, because we've got assumptions in there, so it could be plus minus, but it's essentially balanced. So
I just did want to
Sure.
point out, it's probably obvious, but for anyone who's new and has never watched one of these before, notice that at the top it says that all these numbers are in thousands. So if you're looking at the chart and you're getting confused, you have to add 3 zeros to everything. So that's just,
yeah, and we don't do that to minimize the budget. We actually, it's a practice that I've done for a long time. It's easier to read. If it said 225,324, it's like, I just can't read that number and we can't have a good discussion about it. But the fact is it's 200,000, right? So on this next page, you can see there's that $1 million deficit again, but because of transfers, we end up with a net between the 1 million negative and the 1.2 million positive of $200,000 increase. So we're projecting that we'll end the 22-23 year 4.6 million and then add another 200,000 on top of that to end the 23-24 budgeted year at 4.8 million, which is equivalent to, because we have a policy on this, 2.75% of our expenditures. So it's like if you earned $100 as your household income, that's like having $2.75, you know, left over at the end of the year. Yes. So I wanted to circle around on the policy. We have a policy that says that 2.75% should actually be 3.5. And you can see that we did increase it a little bit this year, so it was below 2.75 when we started. And in fact, our original budget, it was more like 2%. So we're making progress to getting there. And we're also probably going to do a little bit of a review of other districts and you know, evaluate where we think that number really should be, look at the risks and the benefits and the reasons that we have it. You know, if we lose the roof off a building, we need to have some money. If enrolment doesn't come in, or one of the other risks that we've got is problematic, obviously we need to have money, so we need to evaluate that.
I see there's a question from the audience. Feel free to come.
There we go. I'm just wondering, in order to sort of increase that accumulated surplus, have we had to make any difficult decisions to cut any programs within the district to sort of help bump that up a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. It's a fair question. It's a good question. And I think the answer lies right at the beginning. I said it's a service level budget, so we're trying to keep the same level of service. What we did do, so you're kind of right, but it's not a program, is we've held on our capital purchases, right? So there were some vehicles that, you know, we'll see how the budget pans out, we'll see how enrolment pans out, but in this budget, we didn't include those purchases of vehicles.
So I just want to clarify, because we were talking about buses earlier. Buses are a capital expense that the province mostly funds, whereas when we replace the painter's van, for example, all of those vehicles has to come out of our operating budget. So that's why, if we don't do some of those things, but obviously if we don't do it forever, then we have vehicles that are falling apart. So it's always a balancing act.
Sorry, just thinking of another one, because I know our enrollment is increasing. Thinking of my school in particular and that big gigantic hole that's right beside Vetter Elementary now. Is there planning in there? Because I know that when we're looking at buying land or building new schools, we have to contribute towards that with the government. Is there a plan in there for having some of that money sort of down the road when that's happening? Because I can only see that that's going to need to happen with how our district is growing, right? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can't point to a line item, but it's certainly in our discussions. Yeah. I mean, we're not presenting the capital budget today, but we did just get SARDIS secondary, and in that case, I think it's fair to say we're not required to make a contribution this time. But you're right, it's probably the next time.
I just did want to point out that BCSTA has advocated for that practice to stop, but obviously, it's better to have the money in the bank if they do ask for it than to have to cut programs.
Oh, actually, this one's mine.
Yes.
I'll take this. We added a slide. So you probably, if you take your mind back a few minutes, you'll remember me saying that when we presented the amended budget in February, we didn't have everything solved at the ministry level. We didn't have all the revenue and not all the costs were reflected yet. Unfortunately, it's beginning to look like we're going to have the same situation again in May. So I've been in touch with the ministry, and we do need to reflect the cost of a 1.25% COLA for all of our staff, well, for all of our staff in collective unions, and we're assuming for everybody in our budget, because it's a cost for the district next year. It's a legal cost. But we do not have any announcement from the ministry on revenue yet for the 1.25. They've given us the announcement for the base, but they haven't given us an announcement for COLA. I've got no expectation on timing at this point, so I think we'll be bringing you, we expect a budget that's about, balanced, but what we bring you will not look balanced because we won't have all the revenue in there because we won't have received an announcement yet. And I just wanted to, given our discussion tonight, I just want to give you a heads up that that's what it's looking like, so you don't get surprised when we come back next time. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. So, Simone said we mostly talk about the operating budget. That's the one we focus on because that's the one we have the most control over, making decisions. We have a capital budget, which we're not going to talk about tonight. To talk about the new big thing that's happening will be our Sardis secondary edition, but then there's a lot of the accounting behind the scenes when we have to track amortization or depreciation and all that good stuff. So we'll spare you the details of that. But I will talk briefly about our special purpose funds, and these are funds, as many of you already know, that are controlled by external sources. So they're given for specific targeted initiatives and are meant to be spent on just that. Some of them can be carried forward into future years, but primarily if we don't use the funds and they can't be carried forward, we would most likely lose them. I can't think of a situation where we've had to give back funds in recent years, but there's always that case. So I've listed here a number of these funds, and at first blush you might look like that we're missing a few numbers on our 23-24 budget. This again is in line with the practice we have with our operating that Simone was just talking about with the COLA, where we can't budget numbers that haven't been announced by the ministry yet. So you can see things like the mental health initiatives hasn't been announced, and the early learning funds is quite a bit lower than this year. We actually anticipate that number to be higher than 558 because we are doing more early learning initiatives this next year as we expand some of our before and after school sites. So expect that number to change when we come to the amended budget. The one thing I will point out is the second line from the bottom, the Family Affordability School Foods Program. If you've heard in the news or in some of our memos or announcements or on our website, the ministry is moving to a school foods program next year, away from a general family affordability fund, which had to do with food security, but also did with school fees. They're focusing solely now on food programs. What that looks like this next year will be a foundation year for the province to figure out how this is going to look. So I assume there'll be a task force struck amongst the 60 school districts to figure out how this, how we can leverage and best use, best practices to get this going. 1.8 million sounds like a lot of money, but my understanding is it actually doesn't go that far. You're not going to be having breakfast and lunch for every kid in the district with that. So stay tuned for that. But it's a good news story. I think there's definitely need in our district, as we know. So it'll be exciting to see what happens with that. Okay, thank you.
All right, so we're on to, if anyone has any questions, we'll start with trustees, and then if anyone in the audience has questions after the trustees have asked questions, I'll go to the audience before we move on to the rest of the agenda. So trustee Moss.
Thank you. So you mentioned about the food program and talking about them eventually are they eventually working towards feeding every student breakfast and lunch in all the schools?
No.
No. Okay. That's not realistic.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
We need to. Sorry, trustee Bondor.
Hi, okay, thank you for this presentation. I just have a quick question about probably that one that doesn't have a hard and fast answer, but about the COLA and about the one-time provincial grants to help balance the budget. Is it a kind of scenario where those things come out at the last minute to spend according to what the needs are on the ground? Does that make sense as a question? I'm just wondering why it is that always like that with the one-time grants and these extra promised funds that don't necessarily come through until the very last second. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not really sure why they haven't released the COLA yet. I expect there's some sort of trading going on at the ministry. The fact is the ministry and in fact the Treasury and the province sits at the BCPC bargaining table. So they agreed to a 1.25% COLA as part of the agreement. So the money's got to be forthcoming. And once they announce that, it will be embedded into our funding every year. So that portion won't be one time.
Okay.
We have to pass it on to employees, right?
Are we? I'm just going to ask a question because I didn't see. Is our budget going to be balanced as if we aren't getting that, and then suddenly we'll have extra money in September, or are we going to present it as a not balanced budget and then cross our fingers?
Yeah, it's balanced without the 1.25 right now.
Okay.
But we don't have the expense in there, do we?
No, we don't have either side.
Right. So
So-
then, yeah.
So what's gonna?
You said we had to put it in the expense. So when the budget comes forward, is it going to be a not balanced budget, or is
Yes.
it going to be where we don't have reserves?
It's going to be a not balanced budget when you see it at the beginning of May, because what you saw tonight, the expenses will be higher because we'll have to build in the 1.25% COLA increase, but the revenues won't have changed because the province hasn't given us an announcement.
Okay, so I guess then my question is, don't we have to submit balanced budgets by law? So how does that work?
So remember in February we went ahead and we used every single reserve on the book. I think we'll probably be doing the same again.
Okay, so that was actually my question.
Yeah.
So technically,
Yeah.
we have enough money if we pull everything out of reserves to say it's a balanced budget, but in reality, we are hoping to get that money so that we don't have to do that.
I think so. I kind of want to do a survey of British Columbia and see what happened in February, because there must be a district out there that didn't balance and didn't have enough reserves, right? It's like if you're going to ask districts to incorporate a huge salary increase and not give them money for it, somebody's going to have a problem, right? It's not going to work somewhere. But I think in our case, it's not going to be balanced, and yes, we'll probably have to use all the reserves that we have to make it look okay, even though we know that it is balanced in reality.
Trustees, do we have other questions before I ask if the audience has any? Seeing none, is there any member of the public who has any questions about the budget before we move on to the rest of the agenda?
Katie Bartel, DPAC Chair. The 2.3 busing cost, which is only third to Prince George and Sook here, it just seemed really high comparatively to the other districts, and I'm just curious as to why that would be.
So when we're looking at the busing costs, for our district, we're not able to rely heavily on city transit. There is some city transit available and the city continues to work hard to improve that. We also have an extensive routes, so many routes. Over 4,000 students are moving. So we are similar to Prince George. We are one of the a larger busing system. So if you look at some of the metro, it was mentioned, some of the metro sites do rely heavily on city transit and do not offer the busing that we do. So, as we talk about service levels, the service level we provide for busing is, I think, is very good. And we do have a large, over 4,000 students we're busing every day.
To that, it was just really high. Well, all right. Anyways, sorry, am I allowed to ask another question? Okay. 300,000. You said our contribution to the new buses, does that count as a capital expense then, or is that you can get 5 buses for 300,000?
We wish.
We wish.
So I'm going to look at Al. I think we could get 1.5 buses for 200,000. Is that about right?
Yeah,
For 300.
one bus is 200.
Push your button now.
So unfortunately, bigger picture is bus costs, vehicle costs. We've all seen rise dramatically. We're buying the same buses that we did previously. They went from 196 to 247. The ministry hadn't budgeted. The ministry, my opinion, the ministry was surprised by that. There's been many conversations. They're putting forward as much as they can. So they're on a $250,000 bus. They're $60,000 short. 5 buses times 300,000.
Okay, so ours is the 60,000, or our cost is the 250.
Ours is the 60. Yeah.
Okay.
So on 5 buses, they're contributing 1.25 million.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then last question: affordability fund, was it spent? No. So the one that's like the 1.5 this year so far.
So I want to add one thing to that last answer as well. So you said is that a capital contribution? So in school districts in British Columbia, we don't actually have a capital fund other than what the province gives us. So if it needs more money, it comes out of operations. So that money will come out of that operating grant funding, right? So
300 or the above?
the 300.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So where does the other money come from?
That comes from the province.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they'll send us some money, and then we'll top it up with money from the operating fund. Then we'll go and buy the buses. Yeah. In terms of the affordability funds, I think we're currently working on seeing how much we've got left. And in fact, I saw a survey going out to principals just this week, talking about, what are plans for the remainder of the year.
Update coming soon? That it's spent? Or plans to spend it? No, you push your button. Is there an update coming soon then about that it is spent? Like, I know it has to be spent by June 30th, right? The 1.5. So I'm just curious that it will be spent, or if it won't be, if it's not spent, will it be? It is. Has that been announced? I haven't heard that yet. So if that's been announced that it's carryover, that would be great. But yeah, okay.
Sorry, do we have an answer for that, Secretary Treasurer?
I think we're going to release more information once we've completed our survey and spoken with administrators throughout the district. Yeah.
Oh, I did want to just point out, trustees did have a learning session where we were getting a sort of a preview of this presentation so that we could be clear on what was going on. And the bus thing came up, and we did ask if we could just buy less buses. And that wasn't an option. So just so you know, we did ask that question. It was like, you get 5 buses. If you don't want to spend 300,000, you get fewer buses. There was no option to get Trustee Swanky.
Thank you, Chair. 2 clarifying questions, if I may. First, just regarding the bus funding, I'm correct in the understanding that it's not a shortfall unique to our district. Every school district in the province received that? Thank you. The second question was just about keeping transportation costs in check. There's not much we can do, but I am wondering, one of the things that could happen is if we did have schools in their neighborhood, there might be less cost to moving students to the overflow school. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, absolutely correct. And I do want to say our team works very, very well with the city, and we continue to work with them on the high priority areas where we can see that city transit would be very helpful. And the city has responded, to us on that, looking into it and trying to add those routes. So we continue to supplement that. If we can build schools in the proper area, absolutely, that is very helpful. It has been difficult finding property. When we do come across properties like the Imagine High site, we need to take advantage of getting those properties. And we continue to work very hard on finding properties. So.
All right. I'm not seeing any further questions, so we are going to move on to our next agenda item. Reminder that there is public participation, 2 other public participation periods. If anyone in the audience suddenly comes up with a question about the budget, you're welcome to ask that at that time as well. So we are moving on to 2.2, strategic plan update, 90-day cycle. Superintendent?
Thank you, Chair. So what we have is we normally present qualitative and quantitative data. Generally bring up at the middle of September, we provide our FESL report, Framework of Enhanced Student Learning report, that includes a lot of the system level data. What we're going to have today are data stories. We have 3 from it. If you look in the board package, there are multiple video clips. We're going to highlight 3 stories, and this is going to be based on transitions. The first one will be District Principal of Early Learning, Nicole Driscoll, will provide us an update around early learning. That's the first one. And then what we'll do is, once we have each one, best trustees then ask questions before we move on to the next video clip, and then the assistants will also provide some context.
Trustee Bondar?
I don't know if anyone can answer this. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because Nicole's not here. That first one she mentioned, is that meant to replace Strong Start? Or is this an addition to Strong Start? Or maybe could somebody comment on that?
Mrs. Jordan will.
Thanks, Trustee Bondar. It's in addition to, so it's an extra layer of early learning opportunities that Nicole and her team are providing in our schools.
Trustee Swanky. Oh, no, sorry, Trustee Westerby.
Just wondering how frequently the 8-week program runs for the Parent-Child Mother Goose.
Thanks, Trustee Westerby. I don't have the answer to that one, but I can find out for you. I know it does run on a rotating basis, so and I'm not sure where the schedule is published, so we'll get back to you on that one.
Trustee Swanky.
Thank you, Chair. Just regarding the Mother Goose programming, is it in partnership with the Fraser Valley Child Development Center, or is it a unique offering from the district, but the same sort of, not curriculum, but the same sort of programming being presented?
So good question. Nicole sits at the Chilliwack Community Early Years table, and so lots of those programming are in partnership. So this one that she spoke about, though, is run by school district staff.
So are we on to the next?
Yeah, the next one will be about the GWG Career Connections, and Mrs. Jordan will talk about it. I'll put up the one pager. Thanks.
Thanks, Rohan.
Oh, sorry, Superintendent, push your button. Oh, you gotta push. Push it again.
So this one I'll just connect briefly because it is in your package. But Rohan is always asking us to connect the dots for people. So at our last board meeting, Sean Wicker, our district principal of alternative education and careers, was here with Heather Elliott, and they were talking about our district career umbrella. And so we thought this might be a good story to be able to share with you around how does that impact at schools. And so GW Graham, their term 2 90-day cycle was focused on student engagement, and in particular engaging students through that transitionary period. So they, again, connected to budgets, right, and ensuring their resources are connected to their planning. They utilize some of their additional resources to purchase an additional career advisor, and that career advisor is focused on connecting students at high school into the workplace. And so it starts not at grade 12, it starts in grade 10, and this career advisor meets with every grade 10 student and asks them pointed questions about, hey, what are you passionate about? What are you interested in? And begins those conversations around making those connections about what the possibilities are beyond secondary school, and then providing those opportunities while students actually are in school. So they shared a story of a student that she met with in grade 10, and she said, I'm really interested in the funeral industry. I know this sounds very strange because that would not be something that's common. And this career advisor actually connected this student with a funeral director in our city. A work experience took place, and there was a connection to a school, and this young lady has her school paid for when she graduates. Through that particular connection. So I know that's just one little tidbit of a story. But in this, you'll see it also, the passion of this particular career advisor comes out. She talks about wanting to put our district on the map with respect to workplace opportunities for students. And this connects directly to our strat plan as we want to ensure those meaningful experiences while students are here in our schools and creating those pathways when they graduate. So. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next one is going to be, the next presentation is by District Principal of Indigenous Education, Brenda Point. We've talked about our graduation rates. Indigenous graduation rates are almost at 79%, still less than the all-student graduation rates. We talked about making sure we receive parity within 5 years. So this is a new initiative starting for next school year. It's around grad coaches at the high schools. Let me just play the video for you, and you can ask questions beyond that. Thank you.
Education. As one of the Learning Services departments, we are working closely to align our work with the strategic plan and the goals therein. Through the lens of data-driven decision-making, targeted interventions, high-quality instruction, and collective responsibility, this year we have moved to review our enhanced services within our high schools. Over 20 years, our Indigenous student graduation rate has been on a steady incline, growing from 55% in 97-98 to 78% in 21-22, and in comparison to 85% for non-Indigenous students. Moving forward, our goal is to be more intentional and focused on closing that gap for Indigenous learners. Therefore, while we see a need for Indigenous-focused staffing in schools, we know that the work of indigenizing curriculum is the work of all educators, and it is this collective responsibility of all that is stated in the 9th standard of the BC Teachers Council. So moving forward into 2023 and 24, each high school will now have a grad coach that will work alongside students, families, community, and school staff, focusing on the path to graduation. These positions will replace the secondary enhancement teacher positions, and we will provide updates to all as we continue to review these positions along with the 90-day cycles. Kwasai, thank you so much.
Are there, oh, trustee Bonder.
Not so much a question, but a comment. And I'm part of the IEAC, and we had a presentation about these grad coaches during our last meeting. And it was just a really interesting and inspiring idea that some of the Indigenous students may have individual needs that that wouldn't necessarily be covered by a traditional person in that role. So these grad coaches might have to do everything from finding that student and bringing them back to class to just helping them out in different contexts. So I loved that presentation. It was really nice to see.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So, trustees, would anyone feel that now would be a good time for a break at all? Just because I want to double check, because it's been a while and it's sort of a natural break. Okay, I'm gonna say 5-minute break. So, we'll call a recess till 6:46.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. As was previously mentioned by our Secretary Treasurer, the committee met on April 13th, and those minutes are before you in the package. There were a number of constructive and curious questions from committee members. The discussion used about most of the 2 hours set aside for the committee to conduct their work, and I know that their input was appreciated and helped inform the presentation we received this evening. As was also mentioned, the committee will reconvene on May 4th prior to consideration of any proposed budget for 23-24. That concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next item is 3.2, Education Policy Advisory Committee Report. That's also you, trustees.
Thank you, Chair. The committee continues to meet and complete the work of the policy review. However, for this evening's consideration, we have the minutes from February 13th and March 6th. At the March 6th meeting, the proposed policy of 291 was referred to the board following a request of the board to review policy 719. This was previously recommended for appeal. We'll review the revised policy later on in an agenda, and that can be found further interaction items.
Thank you, Trustee Swanky. I did just want to point out as well, just for anyone who doesn't sit on EPAC, that a lot of times policies go to EPAC and then we work on them a little bit and then they get sent back to staff. And so it can take 2 or 3 EPAC meetings before something actually gets referred back to the board. So that's why sometimes there's not anything on the agenda or only 1 or 2 policies. There's a lot currently being worked on as we speak. Okay, so we're moving on to 3.3, Accessible BC Act update.
Thank you, Chair. So what you have in front of you is an information report about the Accessibility BC Act. I do have a mini presentation. I think I'm just going to go with that and probably answer questions at the end. The first piece would be is that there was widespread consultation conducted by the provincial government back in 2019. Who did the province consult with? And I got this information, nearly 500 people attended 10 regional community meetings held across the province. About 6,300 people filled out online questionnaires. And of that, about 3,700 identified as having a disability. 57 people attended town hall meetings, so extensive consultation process. The recommendation included collaboration with the persons with disability. So at the end of all of that, the key, the notion is that look at service delivery for education, employments, including hiring and retention. It's a key area of consideration. Built environments such as entryways, parks, sidewalks, and parking for considerations, more specifically in school districts, information and communication, and then key piece would be transportation. This next slide is of interest. So what are the key objectives of the Act? The Act aims to increase all persons' ability to meaningfully participate in their communities by attempting to remove barriers through the development of accessibility standards. So really the key objectives are increase meaningful participation in communities, including schools, develop standards for improved services delivery in areas such as education, including critical infrastructure like entranceways, playgrounds, sidewalks, accessible transportation, employment opportunities. The third one is harmonization with other jurisdictions, including federal requirements. Definition of the Act, some key definitions. Disability, part of that is an inability to participate fully and equally in society as a result of the interaction of an impairment and a barrier. A barrier is essentially anything that stops those with disabilities from being included, specifically anything that hinders the full and equal participation of a person with an impairment. Impairment is basically a physical, sensory, mental, intellectual, or cognitive impairment, which is permanent, temporary, or episodic. Episodic means basically a disability, a lifelong condition such as mental health disorders like depression and anxiety. And the key would be is that people living with episodic disabilities experience periods of fluctuating good health and ill health and rely on proper care, monitoring, and treatment. So that's really key to be able to mention that. Now, this new act goes a step further than the human rights legislation. Requirements for school districts, pretty much creating an accessibility committee. It's part of the information report by itself. Develop an accessibility plan and establish a process for receiving public feedback on a continuing basis. So for our school district, if you actually look at the information report, and I can go back and just summarize, it talks about, so if you look at the Act by itself, this information here is right from the Act. It talks about who's going to be on the committee. So the committee actually includes, the committee will include members from inside and outside the district and have at least one Indigenous person. At least half of the members should be persons with disabilities or represent an organization that supports persons with disabilities. If I flip back to the information report, we collectively came through this criterion. This committee will include representation from a person with a visible or invisible disability, a member of a disability serving organization, a parent, guardian, caregiver supporting a student with a disability, a person with Indigenous background, a person from another equity deserving group, and that's for Chilliwack. Getting back to the presentation. So realistically, the next one would be is the plan. So the district must create an accessibility plan that will identify how to identify, remove, and prevent barriers within the district for those who interact with it. The plan must be reviewed and updated at least once every 3 years, and it's continuous. It's a green plan. And the district must consult with the accessibility committee in developing and updating the plan as indicated. Next one is the plan must consider, and if you go back to the information report, it talks about, and I'll talk a bit about the timeline, but it talks about the fact that what the plan must, so in developing and updating an accessibility plan, the school district must consult with the accessibility committee and consider the following principles. The first one is going to be inclusion. Refers to the idea that everyone in the district should have the same opportunity to participate in every aspect of life to the best of their abilities and desires. The second one is adaptability, refers to an institution's ability to adjust quickly to changes in the physical and social environment. Diversity refers to an understanding that each person is unique and brings with them a unique heritage, perspective, and a set of lived experiences. Collaboration is self-explanatory. The last one is universal design, is part of inclusive practices we've been talking about as part of the school district work. Refers to the process of creating products that are equally accessible to all, or at least a wide range of people with differing abilities, disabilities, and other characteristics. And then just going back to the timeline, and again, we got a timeline out here, talks about the fact, but again, I'll just go back to the survey goes out on April 6th, and at the end of the day, that was, I think, on a Thursday. We actually presented the information to the Board of, sent that information out to the Board of Education on a Tuesday, shared that with all of our leaders Thursday morning, and the information went out Thursday afternoon. April 6th to 27th is the time frame for applications to be submitted. May 1st, the committee members are going to be selected, and then May 1st, we're going to communicate that to all of the applicants. The goal is to have 3 meetings, May 8th, May 29th, and June 19th, a draft plan, because the fact that the goal is in September, when we do come back, we do want to present the plan to the Board of Education, keeping in mind the plan is going to continuously change as we review as a school district. One other piece of information I want to talk about is that reporting requirements. Realistically, there are no reporting requirements. There are penalties for not submitting a plan, but reporting requirements that would be ongoing. It needs to be posted on our district website. It's a public-facing documentation. The next big piece would be all of this information now, and again, I'm going to thank Talena, did a wonderful job creating a public, we have a website that's called Let's Talk Chilliwack. It's a public engagement site, and that's been created. And so what I'm going to do is, Talena, you want to give us some information about that site, and I can go to the website itself.
You're going to the website?
I will, yeah.
Okay, so as you're going to the website, if you filled in any of our public surveys before using our Bang the Table engagement platform, this is the same place. It's Let's Talk SD33. And we have, if you want to, I think you can go a little step further. Scroll down, Rohan, it'll take you there. There's a link there, Let's Talk SD33. Thank you. So there's just a little preamble there. Basically everything Rohan has told you already. We set up the timeline on there, and we have the committee application form on there and the survey or the feedback for accessibility in the Chilliwack School District. And what's interesting about this is we also want to hear what accessibility features are working well in our district, because maybe there is a school that or a site that something's working well and we need to transcend that across other sites. So you can see all that information there. We also were learning about accessibility as a team, so we've added a few features. We've put some QR codes on there. We have captions on some of the images. We've also created PDF documents in large font. I learned that for people who have site requirements, that the font is size 24. So a few extra pages on that, but we made sure that we had that available as well in case anyone needed it. You can see the timeline is exactly as Rohan outlined. Keep going down. Thank you. You can click there for the surveys. And as of today, we have 18 applications and 17 feedback surveys filled in.
Can I ask just a question? You had the list of all the, members that we need on the committee. Is that the total number of members, or is there more total numbers of members, but a certain number of them have to be from those?
That's correct.
Sorry.
5 to 10 members.
Sorry, Trustee Westerby, you can talk next week.
Oh,
Push for a minute. Yeah.
Sorry, 5 to 10 members. That
Okay.
criterion is right from the Accessibility Act, and that's our district consideration.
Okay, so that was, I think, 6 or something. So there can be up to 10 members
Correct.
on the committee, but there's a certain number that have to follow.
That's correct.
Okay, perfect. Trustee Westerby.
I actually answered my own question, but I did want to say that I gave some feedback on the accessibility of the accessibility website, and it was reflected here, so I really appreciate that work and all this work in general. So, thank you.
Trustee Reed?
Yeah, so I was just wondering from a district perspective, I know you said that this is from the Disability Act, so I that was part of my question. But do we have an eye to including staff members with disabilities as well as community members to make sure we have employee equity as well?
Good question.
Great question, and I think we've actually come up with the criterion, but that will be a consideration as we receive the applications.
Trustee Proce?
Yeah, this is probably directed to Rohan. How would this get paid for if we had to do a lot of improvements in the playground equipment and in some of the buildings? Is there a plan to pay for this? Because our budget doesn't give us that much.
That's a great question, and I think the whole intent is to look within our own resource allocation to be able to implement and to enhance standards. Having said all of that, if there was a priority, then we have to go back and look for dollars at that particular point.
There are also sometimes capital plan stuff, right? Like playgrounds and stuff, you can apply for funding, correct? Trustee Swanky?
Thank you, Chair. First, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate the interest from the community and those that have put their name forward to support the work of the district in this initiative in this direction. I also want to acknowledge we're early in this journey, so some of my questions may be ones that you can anticipate down the road, but may not be able to answer today. I'm wondering, is the committee an ad hoc committee to be struck at the time of development and maybe future review? Or is this a standing committee that's going to support the implementation and the ongoing review because this is described as evergreen? I'm also wondering, how is the proposed plan adopted and approved? You indicated it's a report to the board. It's not approved by motion, is my assumption, but is it approved by the committee? Or is it approved by the committee and received by staff? Like, where is the threshold at which this is the plan, it's been received, we're committed to working to implement it? I do have another question, but I'll start with those two.
Thank you. So first of all, it's a district plan, and we receive input and consideration from the Accessibility Committee. And then at the end of the day, the goal is to bring it back to the Board of Education to be able to clearly outline the steps we hope to take. And it's a green plan that'll change on a regular basis.
So, yeah.
And to your first question about the outline of the committee in terms of timeline, we've asked the committee or the people who are applying to be able to commit to that first year. And that's outlined in the letter on Let's Talk. And it will be a committee that will be struck annually, or maybe they'll look at the composition of it and say, does everyone want to continue, or do we need to open this up and bring in more voices? So it gives people opportunity who are coming and going in the district.
Okay.
And it will be reviewed regularly. There will be a process for that in the plan.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you. You said you had another question, yeah?
If I may, Chair, and this is more a question you could anticipate in the fall. I'd be interested in understanding who or which members of the team are responsible for the oversight and the implementation of the plan once it's presented. I'm assuming it's not simply resting on one person's shoulders. It also may end up interacting with things like our long-range facilities plan. So understanding the interaction between this plan and other guiding documents, I think could be really beneficial given the board's position of governance where we're not approving this plan, but we need to understand the implications. As my colleague said, perhaps be advocating if there's a lack of funding to follow through on this commitment that government's asking us to take on.
I can take part of that. From what I understand on what the internal working group has looked at so far is that there might be working groups struck based on pieces of the plan. Like say it is more facilities based, there might be a working group that'll look at that piece of the plan. If it's tech and infrastructure on the web design, that would be a working group within that department or the people involved in that. So I think it would be pieced out that way, but that still has yet to be developed.
Okay.
Yeah. Initial thinking.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, it's an integration. It's a whole district approach, right? So it's multifaceted. And so I see every single department somewhat involved, and then I see departments coming in to do a certain amount of work and then liaising out and another department coming in. I think the idea would be is that, and I have to say this, perhaps in the past sometimes becomes a step-by-step approach. This is a way of us doing business moving ahead. It impacts the district philosophy, and I think we really want to spend time and energy and effort being very mindful of the steps we take, if that makes sense.
Okay, trustees, I'm not seeing any more questions, so we're going to move on to 3.4 BCSTA report. Trustee Reed.
Yes, thank you. I'll keep it exceptionally brief because we do have the AGM coming up at the end of April, which we're all looking forward to. You can find the motions, of course, for the AGM on the BCSTA Hub. I just wanted to highlight a couple things that they sent out in case you missed it. On April 13th, in the email, they did ask us to fill out a Disability Alliance BC Accessible Organization Project Survey. So they would like us all to take a moment to fill that out if we can. And then on April 26th, there is a Teach Food First program that's coming up. I know that a lot of us are interested in food security. So it's just a 1-hour program you can sign up through. Again, one of the emails from BCSTA. And then they just highlighted that there's a new module on the Hub as well for student success, which wasn't there previously. So if you've done the modules already, there's a new one. And that's everything.
Thank you so much. Okay, moving on to 3.5, trustee written reports. They are in the package for you to peruse at your leisure. Okay, 4, we're on to public participation, comments or questions concerning the agenda. So I'm just going to read out some norms for public participation. The public board meeting is the formally designated means of transacting board business. So you have the opportunity to provide comments and or ask questions about business or issues pertaining to the board agenda. There are 2 public participation periods with an allotted time of 15 minutes each. Speakers will be limited to a total of 2 minutes each. Please state your name and your relation to the district and which agenda item you're speaking to. We can't speak to anything under, illegal matters, and please don't identify any individuals in your question. That all being said, if anyone has any questions, you can come to the podium. Okay. Not seeing any questions. There's another period in case you suddenly wished you'd spoken now. You'll have another chance later. We are moving on to action items. So 5.1 is 2023-2024 capital plan bylaw. This is, I'm assuming, Secretary Treasurer or Superintendent?
Yes, so we're presenting tonight an official board action to approve, to approve the expenditure on capital that was approved by the ministry. So every year we make a request to the ministry to fund certain projects. They've just sent us a letter detailing what those projects are, and before we go ahead and spend that money, we do need the board's approval to do so.
So are you gonna go through the?
Oh, should I read through those?
Are you gonna show us the capital plan before we? You need to tell us what the capital plan is before we make a motion.
I think we attached the letter.
Yeah, it's attached. Keep going. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There we go. Scroll down to the second page. So it's got two main categories. One of them is major, and you can see there's two ongoing and developing major projects there. But really what we're approving tonight is the minor capital. So if you scroll down, this is the second. And that is major, you know, they call it minor, but for most of us, you'd consider it to be pretty major. A roofing upgrade, you know, it's two roofing upgrades, an HVAC upgrade. I think there's one more minor project underneath on the next page. There we go, an accessible playground equipment. And then our six buses are here. So you can, they've just listed them all there. 5 buses.
5 buses. Yeah.
5 buses at 60,000 additional contribution for us.
I just had one question about this. Just I noticed it when I was reading through the package. So all the wheelchairs, all of the bus purchases specifically say with 0 wheelchair spaces, and I'm just wondering about that. Is there like why it would specifically highlight that, and what's the difference in cost of buying a bus that is accessible, for example?
Thank you. So in the 80-passenger bus, the very large buses, those are designated with zero wheelchair spaces. When we do require accessible buses, we have 7 special needs buses, which have wheelchair lifts. And generally what we do is those are smaller, shorter runs. And so at this time, we are not replacing any of the wheelchair fleet. These are the ones that have come up by time and mileage to be replaced.
Okay, so I guess my follow-up was just, like I know city buses have a spot at the front of a normal bus that has a spot for a wheelchair. I recognize that would cut down some of the capacity on a school bus, and maybe we don't need it all the time, but is it possible to buy at some point a bus for the district? So for example, when there's a field trip and there's one student who has a wheelchair, that all the kids could go on the bus together. I'm just wondering if that's a thing that exists that could be purchased.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll support, if a school requires a wheelchair lift, then we would support it with a bus with the wheelchair lift. And sometimes thinking about the wheelchair lifts, there's extra assistance required as you're doing that work, and the drivers are trained and may even have help as they're helping students board and leave the bus.
All right. Were there any other questions about the capital plan bylaw before we actually vote on the capital plan bylaw? Yes, Trustee Swinky.
Thank you, Chair. Question that's as much to confirm my own understanding as anything. This is a necessary bylaw in order to release the dollars from the province to proceed with these capital costs and contributions. But I suppose within this, there's also a tacit commitment from the district to produce that $300,000. We're committing ourselves with this motion, are we not?
Effectively, yes. I mean, there is, I'm looking at Al now because I'm about to say something that might be a little controversial, but you know, we could be accepting the funding for the buses and decide to what you were saying earlier, decide to only buy 4 buses, but then the province will adjust down our number of buses in the future. But that would require less funding from us. So, yes, mostly.
Thank you. I just wanted that to be honest, Chair. Thank you.
Trustee Westerby?
Thanks. Just a question about the buses. You said it's 5 new buses per year. Does that mean we're retiring 5 buses as well in it?
Yeah, good question. We are adding 2 routes to our fleet, and that's something the province is aware of, and we're replacing 3 buses.
Oh, Yeah, yes, so just, this is a bylaw, and bylaws require 3 readings. We can do all 3 readings in one night, but the first motion is to do 3 readings in one night, and that has to pass unanimously, otherwise we can't do all 3 tonight. So, just so you know, not to influence you, but this is something we basically have to do, so it makes sense to do it on one night. But if you really need to think about it, then wait, you don't have to vote for that, no pressure, but that's the rationale with the bylaw you have to do. You can't do them all in one night unless everyone agrees to do that. Trustee Swick.
Thank you, Chair. I am going to make the motion. I will read it slightly different from what was presented. The date needs to be corrected, but I would move that the Board of Education approve 3 readings of Capital Plan Bylaw number 2324, CPSD 33-01 at the April 18th, 2023 meeting of the board.
Seconded by Trustee Bondar. Is there any discussion on that?
Briefly.
Yes, Trustee Swick.
I would just say I normally don't speak in favor of conducting all 3 readings of a bylaw in a single meeting. In this instance, this is money committed to us by the provincial government in their budget. There's no influence we have over it. So this releases those dollars and gives staff clear direction that they can proceed with these capital projects. So I would encourage members to consider that.
Trustee Westerby, are you wanting to speak to the
I
motion?
just
as
had
well?
a kind of a clarifying
Okay, yeah.
question about reading all 3 at once tonight. Has everyone in all our community partners had a chance to speak to this and given thorough feedback before we go ahead and push everything forward in one night?
I mean, insofar as we've presented at a public board meeting and allowed questions on the agenda.
And that was.
Typically, it's not.
Yeah, and it was part of the capital plan that was proposed and approved by the board in June.
Just to clarify, typically it's the capital plan that gets feedback. This is just like, we're getting the money, are we allowed to spend it? Which isn't really the part that needs feedback. It's like, we already presented the capital plan and got feedback about what the plan is, and then this is what the government said yes to from the plan. Basically, just to clarify. All right, anything else? Okay. All those in favor of approving doing all 3 readings of the capital bylaw this evening? That's unanimous. Thank you, trustees. Okay, so now we'll get a motion to actually approve the 3 readings. So this is a separate motion now. I know it seems silly in some ways, but it is, you know, in case anyone didn't want to do 3 readings, we have to do it that way. Does anyone want to make the next motion?
I'm just reading the first reading, or are we doing them
We
all
can do
together?
them as one motion.
Okay.
Yeah, you can say first, second, and third
Okay,
readings.
thank
Yeah.
you. I'll move that. I will move that the board approve the first, second, and third reading of the capital project bylaw number 2023-24 CPSD 33-01.
Seconded by Trustee Westerby. Any discussion, Trustee Ponder?
I feel good.
Does anyone else wish to say anything about this? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of approving the first, second, and third reading of the capital project bylaw this. That's unanimous. Thank you, trustees. Okay, so we are moving on to 5.2, policy renovation project. And the first item is 5.2.1, policy 291, environmental stewardship.
Thank you, Chair. This, just want to provide some context. We started this journey back in December 2020. And so realistically, if you look under the new policy manual consideration, and I'll just move the document up, the new sections are bylaws. The governance section is 100. The 200 section partner and community relations and the 300 section students instruction and programs are part of the work done by the Education and Policy Advisory Committee. These were the previous older policies were the 500 sections, the 600 section instructional programs, and the previous 900 section, which was community relations. This policy was part of the policies to be considered to be repealed back in December of 2022. And the board then requested the policy be sent to EPAC for consideration. We worked in the policy during the months of January, February, and March. And so this will be the final policy of the 200 section, partner and community relations. The policy is in front of you. What we have done is we've also included, we've seen the changes there. You see the old policy as well as the additions to it. We've also added the administrative procedure to provide some context, as well as the administration procedure also was shared with staff to consider around reporting structure back to the Board of Education regarding considerations. So over to the board.
Okay, does anyone have any questions before we make the motion? And then once the motion's on the floor, we can discuss the policy. So first, any questions, what we're doing? Okay. Does any?
Yeah, so the motion is that the board reaffirms, and that would insinuate that the policy is the same and we're just reaffirming it, but this is not really reaffirmed at all. This is a lot of additions and whatnot, right? So it's not really reaffirmed, just
I can see your point. Perhaps it should say
to be a
pass
stickler.
Policy 291, or adopt.
You could say adopt. Generally, we take an existing policy and we provide context.
Oh, sorry, Trustee Moss, can you push it?
So in the past, I use the language reaffirm. Generally, we would take a policy and then would add to it. It's still the same policy. It's a revised version of it with a new number under the new policy manual. So hence use the same schema.
So everything that we see in red here is new to this policy, correct?
Scratches and already scratched out.
Yeah, so some things that are in red that are not crossed out are new. The things that are in red that are crossed out were in the old policy and have been removed. So it's a bit of a mix.
That's a weird
And we
name.
have several copies.
So red represents, it's a marked up copy. It's the way Word looks when you make changes. So any changes are red.
So the wording, this policy is intended to confirm the board's commitment to incorporating environmental stewardship into decision-making and planning.
That's new.
That's new.
Yeah, this is the new policy right here.
And so all the red is new.
Well, there was one sentence.
Except for the one, except for the one that's, okay. It just seems like we don't really need to state the obvious that.
Okay, so
that this policy is
right now we're
intended.
not debating the policy. Right now I was questions about the policy. So then we're gonna put the motion on the floor and then we can debate whether we wanna pass this motion. You had a question about the word
Yes.
reaffirm.
Yes,
So-
so when I was asking for clarification for what we were looking at as well along those lines, so carry on.
Right, so, okay, so, I have personally no problem with the word reaffirm, but if people would prefer to use the word adopt and then everyone's happy about what we're actually voting on, I would be fine with that word being changed. Does anyone have an opinion about that? Trustee Swanky?
Thank you, Chair. I was only going to point out that there may be validity to the questioning of reaffirm, but it is consistent with previous motions of the board. I'm looking at an agenda package from January of this year, this term, in which we reaffirmed policy 312, which was previously policy 512, and it was amended when it came to the board table to be reaffirmed at that time.
Yeah, honestly, it makes no difference to me, so it sort of depends on, I'm happy to have someone read it the way it was presented in the package. If the person who makes the motion chooses to use the word adopt instead, that would be also fine with me.
The only reason I raised that was because I was looking for clarification as to this policy and the red, what was new, what was old, and were we reaffirming blah, blah, blah. So that's the only reason I raised it. I'm not trying to be difficult.
Okay. Would anyone like to make the motion so we can actually, Trustee Swanky, thank you.
I would move that the Board of Education reaffirm policy, no, that's the one back in January. I would move that the Board of Education reaffirm policy 291, environmental stewardship, previously 719, environment, as presented. This policy was presented at the Education Policy Advisory Committee in its draft form at its March 6th, 2023 meeting.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Trustee Ball. Trustee Swanky, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Only briefly, Chair, and I do appreciate the time. We do have multiple iterations of the proposed policy that reflects work done by the committee through 2 meetings. I referenced both meetings in February and March, so hence some of the confusion around different iterations of the policy. I do want to highlight, I think there's a lot of value to this policy. It reflects why the board, I think, sent it back to the committee, and I think the work of the committee speaks for itself in this proposed policy. Finally, I would just add that from the committee, there was a lot of good discussion, and there was general consensus and support that this was ready to come forward, and that would serve the district well. So,
Thank you, Trustee Bondar.
Yeah, I just want to mention I read all the iterations of this policy, and I am really happy with the current form, the final form, as we are in a climate crisis, and it is important for us to create policy that aligns with that and how we can actually move forward through this, instead of just ignoring it. So thank you.
I'll just very briefly speak to the motion as well. I'm on EPAC, so I just wanted to point out, I think that this is a really good example of why we have EPAC, the board was presented with the idea of repealing this policy because it was just a sort of one sentence and it didn't really say much on what was the point of having it, and then the board decided that we felt that the environment is quite important and that we should actually have a policy about environment, and then it was sent back to EPAC, and between staff and the EPAC committee and several meetings, we've come up with a policy that I think speaks to district values. So I think it shows good work in the way that we can work together with all partner groups to get good policy. So thank you. Trustee Westerby.
Thank you. I just want to speak in favor of this motion. It is of this policy. Sorry, it is very important that we recognize our position in environmental sustainability. And what I really love about it is it not only talks about the board's and the staff's commitment to environmental sustainability, but also creating and nurturing a mindset amongst the students as well, which is imperative going into the future. So again, I want to speak in favor of this motion and the good work of EPAC.
All right, not seeing any further comments. All those in favor of the board reaffirming policy 291, environmental stewardship, previously 719, environment, as presented. Opposed? All right, that motion carries. Okay, on to 5.2.2, policy 510, financial awards. This is a repeal, I believe.
That is correct. Just as a summary, we have a total of 145 policies in our policy manual, and the end result, when I'll bring a board report to the public board meeting, it's going to be down to 91 policies that are not repeated under the School Act or ministerial orders. Part of that work would mean repealing approximately 45 policies, and some of the work has started. These are 3 policies for consideration. The first policy, and I think part of the principle around the policy manual revision was around the fact that not to duplicate anything that's in the School Act or School Act regulations and orders in council, as well as School Act ministerial orders, because that is there, and then they'll change those orders as required. And so this policy, there is a robust ministry web page that now covers all of the information that was in this policy. The policy was quite brief, and I'll just switch over to that public page. So the public page is district, provincial, you can find that, provincial scholarships. Pretty extensive, talks about the kinds of scholarships, and this is what probably was missing at that time when the policy was constructed, and I think rightfully so, to give information to students, but this now is quite extensive and it's updated. And one of the pieces is that the ministry continues to iterate, update, and provide context back to school districts.
Could we put the policy that we're repealing up on the screen just so people can take a look at it if they're at home and they don't have the agenda in front of them? Great, so trustees, you can see it's pretty brief and duplicated by the provincial government website. Okay, would anyone like to make the motion? Trustee Bonder.
I will move that the Board of Education repeal policy 510, financial awards.
Is there a seconder? Trustee Reed, thank you. Want to speak to your motion, Trustee Bonder?
It seems as though the policy has been made redundant, and I don't think we need it.
Right. Anybody else? Trustee Moss.
Thank you. You know, I value brevity. I value not being wordy and saying things in a concise manner. However, abandoning policies which have to do with, in this circumstance, our community, which is so generous to our students. I think, you know, the key sentence in this policy is the board values locally sponsored community support of students through scholarships, bursaries, and students awards. And you know, saying that it's already in the School Act or it's on the ministry's website, well, good luck finding some of these things. You know, it was suggested at the last meeting that parents could just Google it. Well, you can't. It is very difficult to negotiate and navigate through those sites. And so I really believe that this is an important policy that we need to, it could be rewritten. But I believe that the statement in the center, the middle sentence, is important for us to acknowledge our community and what they give to our students. So I'm opposed to abandoning this policy entirely.
Any other trustees? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering if the Chair would entertain a question through to the other member. Opposing repeal, I understand. I'm not clear on what the direction would be in terms of where this fits in the new policy manual, as the 500 series is now human resources. So this wouldn't fit within the new policy manual. So I'm not entirely sure. I understand not wanting to repeal it, but there isn't direction from that.
I can't speak. Yes, I would assume it would go in the 200 section, partner and community relations, if we were to request that there was but I can't speak. Is that what you're thinking, Trustee Mo? So I would just speak in favor of repealing this motion. I think that part of the reason we're doing this policy review is to abandon things that are redundant, and I think that this one is redundant, and so I would be speaking in favor of repealing. Trustee President.
Yeah, so just for clarification though, but it's not that the board doesn't support student achievement. It's not that the board doesn't value local sponsored community support, and it's not that the board does not participate annually in provincial scholarships programs. So you're saying these three things that we're abandoning from a policy level is still something that we support from a different.
For example, we have the donor dinner every year where the board thanks all of the donors and we invite them to come and say, thank you so much, we appreciate you. That's one of the ways the board values the people who are donating money to our students. I think that would be.
Right, so that's what, just to clarify that, but it's not that we're abandoning any of these principles, it's just that they're rewritten in a different policy format.
Well, they don't necessarily need to be in policy is, I think, the thought that we show our gratitude in other ways, and the actual finding of information about scholarships and bursaries is on the government website. That's the logic, I believe. But can you speak to that again, Superintendent? Since it's you who is suggesting we abandon, I should let you speak.
Thank you, and I hear Trustee Mars, thanks for your feedback. At the end of the day, having a policy that talks about the fact that we support our community and we appreciate, we do it in multiple ways. I think this policy, when it was written, has three pieces. One was around the fact that we support recognized student achievement through bursaries. Number two, we appreciate locally sponsored community supports for students. Third one was the Ministry of Education guidelines around school district participating in provincial scholarships. So there's two pieces to it. First of all, we appreciate our community on a regular basis in multiple ways. Number two would be that the third line around provincial scholarships now resides somewhere else. And at the end of the day, this is going to be a policy that just sits there. I believe part of the policy manual is giving the district direct. What does the board, the what piece comes around, and then the admin procedures talks about how we proceed with the what that's outlined in the board policies. This information is conveyed by us appreciating our community on a regular basis. Even at commencement as well as our bursary dinner, we appreciate and support and value members of our community providing bursaries to our students.
And we also refer to them in our vision, mission, and motto as partners in learning as well. Trustee Westerby.
Thank you, Superintendent. I just wondering if you could please speak to how removing this policy might affect parents, families, caregivers, and students in their access to scholarships and bursaries, if it will at all.
It doesn't change anything because the process is still the same. So every year we've got a scholarship committee. Students are encouraged by their school liaison people to apply for scholarships as well as university scholarships. And then there's a provincial scholarship component. So nothing of that changes. And then on top of that, as partners and also as members of the Board of Education, we continue to value the members that provide context and bursaries to our students. So nothing changes. It is one less policy in a policy manual that doesn't convey that information.
Trustee Moss?
So if I was a person who wanted to create a bursary, and I wanted to have a look through our policy book and see, so what does this board believe? Are they encouraging this? How do I go about doing this? Is there a place where I can find that information out on our website?
Thank you. So from what I know is all of the scholarship information is communicated to all of our high schools and our community through our high schools on a regular basis. No one should be surprised. And I know that as we approach commencement graduation season, that is going. So Mrs. Jordan and Mr. Savage, you can probably know.
I can share that we do have a process when community members want to come and donate money. So there is a form that gets filled out. They talk about, why they're creating that bursary, what qualities they're looking for in applicants. So there is a process. They connect with the board office and we put them through to Talena or Joanne and they help them through.
I wanted to
Trustee Reid.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Never mind. No, I do. I was going to press it. Thank you. I actually was very curious about this as well, so I did look it up, and there is a whole section on becoming a donor, and it affirms kind of our values on that front and those sorts of things, as well as information for the students. My question would be, are there other places? You mentioned the vision, mission, and values, and as we're going through these policy repeals and revisions, it seems like we've come across a few things where it didn't have a place in policy, but it is something that the board values, that the district values, that doesn't quite fit under the mission, vision, and values. Or, yeah, you know what I mean. So I was just wondering, typically, is there somewhere else that we can affirm those sorts of things? Like if we wanted to say, like, the district does value... I'm trying to remember. There were at least two other policies where we said, "Oh, we do support this," but it wasn't a policy level thing, so we removed that. Is there another level of affirmation?
Yeah,
to that?
I sort of hear what you're saying. I think maybe Superintendent, you can clarify this. It seems to me that we have had policies where we say the board likes this, but then the rest of the policy is more of a direction. Like the problem with this policy is there's no direction.
It's not operational, but we do
Yeah.
want information.
I hear what you're saying, and I think somewhere on our district site, and I think either that, and I've got to check with Joanne, who looks after the scholarship committee, we can easily, and I think, Trustee Moss, you're talking about the second sentence in that around valuing our partners. I think that's what you are trying to make sure we don't lose sight of. So that can be embedded.
Trustee Moss, sorry, I cut you. I'll go to you, Trustee Westerby, but Trustee Moss actually had a follow-up to her question that we sort of preempted, so I'm going to let her go back.
Thank you. Yeah, my follow-up was, so there are admin procedures somewhere in our policy book
I have to go check.
for direction, not just at the high schools? Okay, and one more quick item to consider is is board policies are exactly what Trustee Reed just said. They're philosophical statements about where this board is coming from. And so this, where the community is so generous, I mean, I would like to see this rewritten because I don't think it's particularly well written. But that is exactly the point. It's a philosophical statement that supports what the board values. And then an admin regulation actually should go along with this so that people know.
Trustee Westerby? Thanks. And we absolutely have an incredibly generous community. And I just want to clarify some things that removing this policy wouldn't affect the community's ability to sponsor our schools and sponsor our students. I know many places do that. So Rotary, for example, they have many scholarships. Chilliwack Pride, Emily Patton, they have scholarships, but they're not connected to the schools. They're just the community supporting students. So this, in that sense, doesn't affect that aspect of the community being generous towards our students. This is really just the connection to and through the school scholarship program. Is that correct?
Correct. Superintendent, did you have?
I think, sorry.
I saw you, but I'm just going to let him answer.
I think just to go back, first of all, if I look at the whole notion of the ministry provincial scholarship, there's lots of information on the ministry side, it's policy around that. If you're looking, and I think that's a value in sentence number, paragraph number 2, the board value is locally sponsored. That can be embedded on our school district sites, district websites, high school sites, as well as a district site. So we do recognize and value. Doesn't have to be a policy statement. It has to be a statement that we value our partners that contribute on top of all the things we do in the community because we really appreciate their generosity. And I think that's if I'm correct, Trustee Mars, that's sort of the consideration here.
Trustee Posey?
Yeah, just speaking to, I think that you have to understand the difference between policy and values. I think there's a difference. Like for instance, on the environmental proposal, that was a policy because it reflected cost savings and usage of lights, usage of materials, better insulation factors when you build, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a policy based on financial return, which makes it a policy, not a value statement. And I think that with this policy, this is not really a policy, it's more of a value statement. So I think we just need to clarify the terms. It's a good statement, but it might not just fit in this policy. So for that reason, I would vote to repeal it myself.
Okay, trustees, I think that we've had lots of comments on both sides, and I think I'm not seeing any other hands up, so we'll move to the vote. So all those in favor of repealing policy 510 financial awards? Opposed? A motion carried. Okay, so we're moving on to 5.2.3, policy 521, challenge for credit, and policy 522, equivalency, and these are both for repeal as well, Superintendent.
Thank you, that is correct. And I'm going to go back to the rationale. There is an extensive policy. This was probably written at the time there was no ministry information in a consistent manner. The ministry has done a great job in trying to amass policy and also be mindful of when they do an update to remind school districts what the update looks like. So all of this information and much more, and then the policy quickly showed the policy so you can have a consider. This is the policy. This links to an older policy that doesn't exist any longer. The ministry has gone ahead and there's extensive information on the ministry site around earning credits. And it's an extensive policy statement that encompasses all of it. And it also talks about the ministerial order. So the information is there for students to consider and it's consistent.
What about the other one? Is that?
Thank you. That's policy 521, challenge for credit, and the next one is policy 522, equivalency. And it's the same thing. They're both embedded now in one common ministerial policy, which is what I just showed to you on the public site. If you read the heading, it talks about all of it combined together on one particular site.
So just to Trustee Maz's point about, for parents, if parents are looking at things, if people go to our website, do we have a link to the ministry website for stuff like this? Like, is it easy for someone in School District 33 to go, I wonder if my kid can get equivalency for this, and find the link to the ministry on our website? Because that's a thing. Like, I don't think we should have it in policy, but if that isn't on our website, I think we should put it on the website, is my point.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem to create that, as long as we continue to monitor that link. Assistant Superintendents, any reflection?
I can take that. Just so on our high schools, they have a parent section and a student section, and most of them will have a grant handbook, which will have that information in there.
Perfect.
We
So if
can
they're on the
double-check
high
that.
school ones, that would
Yeah,
be fine.
that's
Like
where
somewhere
it's
just for if a
relevant.
parent, a parent's gonna go to their high school, they're probably gonna talk to teachers or the principal anyways.
Particularly things like equivalency
Yeah.
and IDS, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I had questions about my kids, I didn't go to the university or the district website. I went to the high school, so I just talked to their teacher. Yeah. Any other questions before we move to the motion? Trustee Moss.
So the information in both of these policies is in fact still valid, correct? There's, in the ministry policy that you previously mentioned, this information is still all valid. Is that correct?
Most of it, I scanned through language where some of the links are broken, but the intent of the policy is there, now it's embedded,
So this is not an actual policy for individual school districts if they wanted to award or change something, or if their child wants to skip grade 12 or whatever. This is all entirely ministry. The school district is not able to do anything different than what is prescribed. Is that correct?
based on the ministry policy, correct?
Well, based on that, if we have this information at each school site, then I can support repealing these as long as it's made evident.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, Trustee Moss, we're not talking to the motion right now. This is for questions. So we're gonna put the
Whatever.
motion.
Okay, fine. Whatever.
I'm sorry, I'm following rules of order.
Yeah,
So
you go ahead.
would anyone like to put the motion on the table, and then we can talk about whether we support the motion or not?
I will move that the Board of Education repeal policy 521, challenge for credit, and policy 522, equivalency.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Trustee Westerby. Thank you. Now that the motion's on the table, Trustee Bondar, do you want to speak to it since you moved it?
I could defer to Trustee Maz on that. I feel that we feel the similar.
Trustee Moss, go ahead.
Well, what I just said, basically, is this information available for every parent? You know what? Actually, this would look real good in a parents' rights policy, wouldn't it? Anyways, this information should be available to parents, though, completely and entirely. So if we can find a way to make sure that parents are able to access this information at every single school, then I would be in favor of repealing it. Otherwise, we need to keep them in some form.
Trustee Prose.
Just point of clarification here. So what I understand by this policy is that this is to do more with people that come into the country that are challenging because of an education system that they come out of? Or is this just somebody that's really smart?
No, it could be like, just say a student had some sort of experience that, through that experience, whatever it might be, was the equivalent of a course that you could take. You can apply to get credit. Like you can get a PE credit if you're like on a gymnastics team where you're putting in a ton of outside time. You can get a PE credit,
Would
for
that
example.
would that still apply?
Yes, yeah, so that's all ministerial now, like that's just the rules, you can apply for those things. So what the superintendent is saying is that we don't need to have policy, because that is just the rules, it's ministry policy, we don't have to have local policy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Trustee Westerby?
Thank you. I believe that there are some students out there who are actually currently working while they're in high school, and so it's a lot for a student to have to go through that. And so sometimes their job actually really hits the mark on what the course and school would provide, and so they can challenge and say, "Hey, my job actually taught me all these things that this schoolwork would have taught me, and so I'd like to get credit for my time here working." Sometimes it's volunteering. So it is a really important thing that our schools and students know about because of how much work that students put out. So I do want to make it clear that everyone knows that this is an option for them, that there are so many different ways to learn and to fulfill your educational requirements. So I do want to make sure that it's very clear to everybody that that's an option, because it is important that it's clear and that we're transparent on it. But I think it makes sense that we are concise and that our policy manual remain that way.
Trustee Reed?
Yeah, I suppose it's a clarifying question. I just want to affirm that this information isn't just available to high school students. Is it available to students in other programs as well, such as those doing distance education, Queequel, like, I can never say the name correctly. Memiathel, yeah.
Superintendent, can you clarify, so when something is a ministerial order or policy, I'm assuming that the principals are aware of these things. Are principals reaching out to students? Are they making parents aware that, these things are options? Because to me, that would be one of the roles of principals. I don't think necessarily people are going to our policy manual for some of this stuff, but I'm just clarifying that that's the case.
So part of the journey is schools, the students connect with their local school counselor as well as school administration. It is an individualized program, lots of conversations. I do have to say, I don't think people go to that policy site to look for that. They probably go to the ministry site. And so realistically, how do we come up with policy that's accurate, up to date, very concise, yet has all the information? I know I can talk to Mr. Jordan and Mr. Savage. Our high schools have this information available to their students on a regular basis, as well as when counselors do consult with. And so to answer the question, are students able to have this information? Can they access that? It's provided for students. It's part of the plan that we have with every single student individually.
Does anyone else who hasn't spoken yet wish to speak? Or Trustee Moss wishes to speak for a second time? No? Okay, Trustee Moss.
I just want to make the point that Trustee Prosy asked about parents being able to access this only if they know it's available. And I know oftentimes this practice is actually discouraged. And teachers say, oh, you want your child to be with the same group of kids. They, or not teachers, but the staff at the school would say, we want to make sure they're socialized properly, blah, 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 blah. And so this is actually discouraged in a lot of cases. And so that's why it's important for parents to know that this is actually right of theirs to be able to advocate on behalf of their child to be able to access this practice. That's why I think we need to keep these policies in our policy book somehow, somewhere. I don't think it just being simply available at the schools is good enough.
Can I just get someone to speak to the idea that staff are actively discouraging students from seeking equivalency, please?
So I can speak, and then maybe Dave and Kirk, you can jump in. But so, as a previous secondary school counselor, oftentimes these would be the conversations that you're having with students as you're mapping out a grad path, and so there it would not, we would be encouraging some of this, for example, opening up a student's timetable. So we know that a student dances so many hours a week and they've done their rad ballet, they could earn certain PE credits or equivalency for PE. So we would be building that into a student's plan. So if you're hearing that, Trustee Moz, I'd be happy to look into that, because I don't believe that
is best practice for students when we're talking about grad planning.
And I agree on that, and also around the challenge process. There is some care taken in when kids are ready to challenge a course. So if a student was, and I was a previous high school counselor as well, if a student came in and said, I want to challenge physics 12, and doesn't have the prerequisites, you would do some digging with that student to ensure that they are actually ready to challenge. So while the ministry gives you that ability as a student to come forward and say, I want to challenge any course, because they allow you to do that, it is used for is finding those situations where there is other evidence that they can take forward. Otherwise, I don't think as a counselor you'd be responsible. So I think there is a little bit of care taken around how challenge is used, but equivalency, like Paula said, is widely used across our system, and often we find things, or this, the schools will find things that the kids haven't thought about themselves when they're been taking piano lessons for years, and you go, well, have you ever thought about getting equivalency for that? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, not seeing any further comments. Am I right about that? Okay. All those in favor that the Board of Education repeal Policy 521 challenge for credit and Policy 522 equivalency? Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. And moving on to meeting summaries. Those are in the package for anyone who wants to take a look at those. And we are on to public participation, comments or questions concerning the agenda.
Hi, I'm Debbie Chand. I'm a teacher librarian in the district at Federal Elementary. I just have a question about the wheelchair accessible bigger bus situation. So I can tell you something that sort of happens at our school, not on a regular basis, but does happen. Say we have one class that's wanting to go on a field trip, wheelchair student. The wheelchair buses often don't take enough kids for the one class. So now the school and the families, when we're charging for field trips, we're needing to cover the cost of two buses. One for most of the class, the wheelchair bus for the wheelchair student, plus perhaps a couple of their classmates. The other thing that happens, and it's around cost, is classes will often try to share a bus. So we've got 3 grade 1 classes with a wheelchair student. Now we've got 2.5 classes on the big bus, and we've got wheelchair student plus some students on the smaller bus. That child doesn't get to sit with their classmates. I think that's an issue. And then we're dealing with a funding piece. So now, and as schools are dealing with having to cover the costs of those field trips and the busing is increasing. I'm not arguing that part. I know that that's happening. But now we're sort of looking to the schools or the families needing to cover a bigger cost because now we have to take 2 buses instead of just 1. And I think that that becomes preventative on field trips, looking at going a further distance. I'm not sure the classes would be looking at going to Britannia Mines when they have to take 2 buses because there is a wheelchair student in one of those classes. So I'd like to encourage, I was hoping, and I know I couldn't talk because you were voting on it, but I'm hoping that the district would look at having one large wheelchair accessible bus so that that can be planned for. And yeah, it's going to be a booking issue, when buses always are, but at least then it's available to be able to work worked around. You phone in and you say, yeah, it's actually only available on this day and this day and this day. Then teachers would plan their field trips accordingly, perhaps. But I think having one available, I think actually is when we're talking about equal access and things like that, I think that that's an important piece that the district needs to look at. Thank you.
One second to spare. Okay, amazing.
That's a real.
Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? All right.
Point of order.
Technically not. What we can do is we can ask perhaps for some more clarification from the facilities manager about the cost. Maybe, I think that question was raised now by me and maybe by an audience member. Perhaps we could get a cost estimate on if one of the buses we ordered did have was wheelchair accessible, how much would that cost? We're already footing 300,000. Like if it was possible, the board sounds like might be curious about that question. Yeah. Do you happen to, if you know it right now, you can.
I'd really like to respond, and I appreciate the comments. And as we're going through this, there's a ton of value in the accessibility piece. Unfortunately, I don't have a cost for you today, but I will provide that as we go through this. And yeah, I appreciate comments. We continue to try and keep costs down. You know, we do comparisons, as we saw percentages of total costs. We do comparisons of operating buses, and our bus fleet, when you do cost per bus compared to other districts, is actually running less. And we do meet as a larger group, all the districts, and have those conversations. So there's a lot of things that transportation is doing very well. And we do need to expand on that, and this is something we'll absolutely look at and see. And the comment on the additional cost, as I'm hearing the comment on the additional cost, if we do require 2 buses, is also something I want to look into and see. That I don't feel it's fair, you know, that the school's having to cover all of that cost or that cost. So I will review that as well.
Thank you so much for question and answer. Oh, sorry, David.
Yeah, so if I can just comment on that, because we do at Student Services. Now, I can't say that in every situation, but whenever a situation comes forward where a student is not able to access, many cases, Student Services pays the fee for the bus that provides that access. So, I mean, we can definitely look into, is there any situations where we were not able to? But I know for sure that that by far the majority of them we are able to support.
Okay, this is, I just want to thank you then for being able to have this conversation. And I think that's what's so valuable here, is to be able to bring up situations when you're making decisions, you might not know that ripple effect sometimes, right? The same as I do in my library. So to be able to comment and have a conversation and to hear some of those pieces, I really appreciate the fact that we can do this. And I just wanted to thank you for fantastic presentation on the budget, because you made it so that it was understandable. You start my timer now? I still got a minute 56. No, but thank you for a wonderful presentation on the budget. It was really well done and easy to understand, so thanks. I can do something. No, we still got to go for tea.
And just, it's looking like there's no other comments, so I just wanted to say, this is why we have public participation, right? And it's interesting. So what was just raised was that there is a cost to not having a wheelchair accessible bus that's a large size. So when we think of, we're saving money by not buying one, we might be actually incurring costs. Even if it's Student Services, that's still, it's just one pot of money. So if we're spending money every year hiring a second bus all the time so that everyone can go to field trips, we might actually save money over 10 years by having one bus that was accessible. So that's the kind of things that people bring up and then we think about. So I can't say that is necessarily true because we're going to get a report. But okay. So thank you so much, everybody. And meeting is adjourned.